I thought I'd finally won over my daughter-in-law when she handed me that glass. I drank, smiling, thanking her for the gesture. I had no idea that minutes later I'd be fighting for my life in icy water. The wine should have been our celebration, but 30 seconds later, I was drowning in paradise, watching my daughter-in-law's silhouette disappear above the crystal-clear waters that were supposed to be my grave. I never thought I'd live to see 68, let alone discover that the people I'd spent my entire life protecting were the ones planning my funeral. But here I am, 6 months later, still breathing, still fighting, still trying to make sense of how a simple family vacation turned into the most terrifying chapter of my life. The irony isn't lost on me that I had to nearly die to finally start living with my eyes wide open. It started so innocently. Rebecca, my sweet daughter-in-law, the woman I thought was the daughter I never had, approached me with those doe eyes of hers during what I now know was a carefully orchestrated family dinner. "Mom Eleanor," she said, using that sugary voice that used to melt my heart. "James and I have been talking, and we think you need some time away, some real relaxation. The stress of managing the estate, dealing with Dad's condition, it's too much for someone your age. Someone my age." The words stung then, though not for the reasons they sting now. Back then, I thought she was being considerate. Now I realize she was measuring my coffin. "We want to take you to the island house," she continued, her manicured fingers dancing along the edge of her wine glass. 6 months of pure paradise, sun, sea, family time. What do you say? I should have listened to the voice in my head, the one that had kept me safe through 7 decades of life, through Richard's early business struggles, through raising James when he went through his rebellious phase, through every challenge that had tried to knock me down. That voice was whispering warnings, but I silenced it with logic. This was family. This was my son's wife, the mother of the grandchildren I adored. This was supposed to be love. "That sounds wonderful, dear," I heard myself saying, sealing my fate with gratitude I didn't know I'd live to regret. The flight to our private island off the coast of Florida was everything Rebecca had promised. First-class accommodations, champagne that bubbled like liquid gold, views that stretched endlessly over waters so blue they seemed artificial. James sat beside me, my 42-year-old son who still had the same dimpled smile he'd worn as a boy, though something in his eyes had changed over the past year. A nervousness I couldn't place, a way of avoiding direct eye contact that made my maternal instincts twitch. "You okay, sweetheart?" I asked him as we descended toward the private airstrip. He startled like I'd caught him stealing cookies. "Of course, Mom. Just excited to spend some real time together. All of us. All of us." The phrase felt loaded, though I couldn't understand why. Our island paradise was everything the brochures had promised and more. The house, a sprawling Mediterranean villa that Richard had purchased during one of his more successful business years, sat perched on a cliff overlooking the most pristine waters I'd ever seen. Bougainvillea cascaded down whitewashed walls, and the air smelled of jasmine and salt and something indefinably tropical that made you forget the world existed beyond this small piece of heaven. Rebecca had thought of everything. My favorite food stocked in the kitchen, fresh flowers in every room, even the books I'd mentioned wanting to read arranged neatly on the bedside table. She'd hired local staff to handle the cooking and cleaning, leaving us free to simply enjoy each other's company. Maria, the housekeeper, was a weathered woman in her 50s with kind eyes and rough hands who spoke English with a melodic accent that made even mundane conversations sound like poetry. "Mrs. Eleanor," she said on our first morning, setting down a breakfast tray laden with tropical fruits and freshly baked pastries. "You let me know if you need anything. Anything at all. I take good care of you." There was something in the way she said it, an emphasis that felt like a promise rather than mere hospitality. I filed it away, not knowing then how crucial that promise would become. The first week was blissful in ways I hadn't experienced since the early days of my marriage. James seemed more relaxed than I'd seen him in months, his laughter coming easier, his shoulders losing that perpetual tension that had become his signature. Rebecca played the perfect hostess, organizing sunset walks along the beach, afternoon swims in the infinity pool, evening card games that stretched late into the tropical nights. But perfection, I was beginning to learn, is often the most dangerous illusion of all. It was during our second week that I first noticed the discrepancies. Small things, barely worth mentioning, except that my 68 years of life had taught me to pay attention to details that didn't quite align. Rebecca mentioned having studied marine biology at Stanford, but when I asked about specific professors I knew from Richard's business connections there, her answers were vague, evasive. She claimed to have grown up in Seattle, but when a sudden rainstorm reminded me of Pacific Northwest weather and I began sharing memories of a business trip there, she couldn't relate to any of the landmarks I mentioned. People experience cities differently, James said when I quietly mentioned my confusion to him later. She probably just has different memories. But it wasn't just different memories. It was no memories at all. I started paying closer attention. Rebecca's stories about her childhood never included specific details. No favorite restaurants, no memorable teachers, no childhood friends who might visit or call. Her past seemed to exist in broad watercolor strokes rather than the sharp, detailed photographs that make up a real life lived. During our third week, while Rebecca and James took the yacht out for what they called a romantic afternoon, I found myself alone in the house for the first time since we'd arrived. Maria was in the kitchen preparing dinner, humming softly to herself, and I wandered into Rebecca's room under the pretense of borrowing a book she'd mentioned. Her personal items were scattered across the dresser with casual precision that suggested she wanted them to look naturally placed while ensuring nothing truly private was visible. But I hadn't survived 7 decades by taking things at face value. I opened the top drawer, telling myself I was just looking for a bookmark, knowing I was crossing a line I'd never crossed before. Inside, beneath carefully folded lingerie, I found a passport. Not Rebecca's current passport, but an older one, expired, with a different name entirely. The photograph was unmistakably her, but the name read Miranda Catherine Holbrook. The birth date was 3 years different from what she'd told us, and the birthplace was listed as Phoenix, Arizona, not Seattle. My hands shook as I photographed the document with my phone, a device James had insisted I upgrade to despite my protests that I was too old to learn new technology. Thank God for his insistence now. I replaced everything exactly as I'd found it and retreated to my room, my mind spinning with possibilities. Maybe she'd legally changed her name. Maybe there was a reasonable explanation. Maybe I was becoming one of those paranoid elderly people who see conspiracies in every shadow. But that night at dinner, when I casually mentioned a news story about Phoenix that I'd seen on television, Rebecca's response was immediate and telling. She froze for just a fraction of a second, her fork halfway to her mouth, before launching into an overly detailed story about never having been to Arizona but always wanting to visit. The lady doth protest too much, as Shakespeare would say. James didn't seem to notice his wife's reaction, but I caught Maria's eyes across the room as she refilled our water glasses. There was a flicker of something there, a recognition that made me wonder if I was the only one who'd started to see cracks in Rebecca's perfect facade. That night, I lay awake, listening to the sound of waves against the cliff below and the whispered conversations from the room next door. I couldn't make out words, but the tone was urgent, strained. Arguments conducted in hushed voices that carried an edge of desperation. The fourth week brought the invitation that would change everything. "Mom," Rebecca said over breakfast, her smile bright as the tropical sun streaming through the dining room windows. "James and I want to take you out on the yacht today, just the 3 of us, a special celebration." "What are we celebrating?" I asked, though something in my chest had already begun to tighten with apprehension. "You," she said simply. "Your health, your strength, your willingness to embrace adventure at your age. We're so grateful to have you in our lives." James nodded enthusiastically, but I noticed he couldn't quite meet my eyes. "It'll be perfect, Mom. Just like old times." Old times. We'd never taken a yacht trip together before, just the 3 of us. But I nodded and smiled and told them it sounded lovely, all while that voice in my head grew louder, more insistent. The yacht was a 40-foot beauty named Second Chances, another irony that wouldn't become clear until later. Rebecca had packed a picnic basket with champagne and delicate sandwiches, and James had loaded fishing gear, though none of us had expressed interest in fishing. The staff waved us off from the dock, Maria's weathered face creased with concern that seemed disproportionate to a simple day trip. "You have radio?" she called out in her accented English. "You call if you need anything?" "We'll be fine, Maria," Rebecca called back, her voice carrying just a hint of irritation. "It's just a few hours." But as we pulled away from the dock, I realized I hadn't seen James check the radio equipment, hadn't heard any discussion of our route or estimated return time. For a man who'd grown up around boats, who'd been safety conscious to the point of obsession since childhood, it was strangely careless. We anchored in a secluded cove about 2 miles from shore, surrounded by water so clear you could see tropical fish darting between coral formations 20 feet below. Rebecca produced the champagne with a flourish, and James opened it with the practiced ease of someone who'd done it countless times before. "To family," Rebecca proposed, raising her glass as the bubbles caught the afternoon sunlight. "To family," James echoed, though his voice sounded hollow. "To family," I agreed, bringing the glass to my lips. The champagne tasted perfect for exactly 3 seconds. Then the world began to shift sideways. My vision blurred first, the crystal-clear waters becoming a watercolor wash of blues and greens. The yacht's deck seemed to tilt at impossible angles, and Rebecca's face became a kaleidoscope of features that wouldn't quite align. "Mom?" James's voice sounded like it was coming from the bottom of a well. "Mom, are you okay?" I tried to answer, but my tongue felt thick and unresponsive. My legs buckled, and I felt myself falling, the champagne glass slipping from numb fingers to shatter against the deck. The last thing I remember before the water was Rebecca's voice, clear and cold as Arctic wind. "Make sure she doesn't suffer." Then I was falling, the warm tropical air rushing past my face, and the ocean was rising to meet me like an old friend welcoming me home. The water was shockingly cold despite the warm afternoon, and as I sank beneath the surface, my mind cleared just enough to understand what had happened. They had drugged me. My own son and his wife had drugged me and thrown me overboard like garbage. But whatever they'd given me hadn't accounted for 7 decades of stubborn determination and a lifetime of swimming in the community pool back home. The cold water was like a slap that brought back just enough coordination for me to kick toward the surface, my lungs burning with the effort. I broke through just as the yacht's engine roared to life above me, and through the water streaming down my face, I could see 2 figures on the deck. Rebecca was pointing in my direction, while James stood frozen, his mouth open in what might have been shock or protest. "She's still alive!" Rebecca's voice carried clearly across the water. "We have to go back." But they didn't go back. They circled once, close enough for me to see James's face, close enough to read the anguish and terror in his eyes, close enough to understand that this moment was destroying him even as he participated in it. Then they were gone, the yacht disappearing around the point, leaving me alone in paradise with nothing but my rage to keep me warm. I should have died that day. A 68-year-old woman, drugged and thrown into the ocean 2 miles from shore, should have become a tragedy, a mysterious disappearance that would make the local news for exactly 1 cycle before being forgotten. Instead, I became something far more dangerous. I became a survivor. The swim to shore took every ounce of strength I had, and several I didn't know I possessed. The drugs made coordination difficult, but anger is a powerful antidote to despair, and I had enough anger to fuel a small nuclear reactor. I kept Rebecca's voice playing in my head like a mantra. Make sure she doesn't suffer. Each stroke toward shore was fueled by the promise that when this was over, she would be the one suffering. I washed up on a rocky beach just as the sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink that would have been beautiful under different circumstances. Instead, they looked like warning colors, like the sky itself was trying to tell me that everything I'd known was about to burn. A local fisherman found me there, hypothermic and barely conscious, mumbling about yacht accidents and champagne that tasted wrong. He wrapped me in rough blankets that smelled of fish and salt and drove me to the small island medical clinic in a truck held together with rust and determination. "You lucky lady," he said in the same melodic accent I'd grown to associate with safety. Current. She bring you to shore instead of out to sea. Someone up there, they looking out for you. Someone up there. Indeed. But I was beginning to suspect that whatever force had saved me hadn't done it out of kindness. They'd saved me for a reason, and that reason was becoming clearer with every breath I took. By the time the island's small police force contacted the main house, Rebecca and James had already returned with their story perfectly crafted. A tragic accident. Eleanor had insisted on standing near the rail despite their warnings. A sudden wave, a loss of balance, a desperate search that had yielded nothing but grief and regret. When I walked into the house 12 hours later, wrapped in borrowed clothes and escorted by a concerned police officer, the shock on their faces was worth every minute I'd spent in that freezing water. "Mom!" James rushed toward me, and for a split second, I saw genuine relief in his eyes. "Oh God, we thought you were dead. We searched everywhere. We called the Coast Guard. But Rebecca's reaction told a different story. Her face went through a rapid succession of emotions: shock, fear, calculation, and finally, resignation. She was already planning her next move before I'd even fully stepped through the door. "Eleanor," she breathed, her hand pressed dramatically to her chest. "Thank God you're alive. We were so worried when you fell overboard." "Fell," I repeated, the word tasting bitter as poison. "Is that what happened, Rebecca?" "I fell?" The police officer was taking notes, asking questions about the sequence of events, but I could see Rebecca's mind working behind her eyes. She was crafting a new narrative, one that would account for my survival while maintaining her innocence. "You were feeling dizzy," she said, her voice gaining confidence as she built the lie in real time. "You said the champagne was making you lightheaded. We told you to sit down, but you insisted on getting some fresh air. When you leaned against the rail, a wave hit the boat and you lost your balance. It was a good story. Believable. It accounted for the champagne, the dizziness, the fall. It cast them as concerned family members rather than attempted murderers. Under different circumstances, I might have even believed it myself. But I had tasted that champagne. I had felt my body betray me in ways that had nothing to do with seasickness or age. And most importantly, I had heard Rebecca's voice as clear as a bell. Make sure she doesn't suffer. The police officer finished his report and left with promises to follow up if needed. The house fell into an uncomfortable silence, broken only by the distant sound of waves that now carried an entirely different meaning. "Mom," James said finally, his voice cracking with emotion. "I'm so sorry. I'm so glad you're okay. I don't know what we would have done if..." He couldn't finish the sentence, but I could finish it for him. They would have mourned appropriately, inherited everything, and gotten on with their lives. The perfect crime, if only I'd had the courtesy to stay dead. That night, as I lay in my bed listening to the familiar sounds of the house settling around me, I made a decision that would have seemed impossible just 24 hours earlier. I was going to find out exactly who Rebecca really was, what she wanted, and how far she was willing to go to get it. But more importantly, I was going to make sure that when this was all over, she would understand exactly what happened when someone tried to kill Eleanor Catherine Morrison and failed. The game had begun, though I was the only one who knew the rules had changed. Tomorrow, I would start playing to win. The first thing I learned about playing a game where the stakes are your life is that you have to become someone you never thought you could be. For 68 years, I'd been Eleanor Morrison, devoted wife, loving mother, pillar of the community. But that woman had almost died in the crystal waters of paradise, and the person who crawled out of that ocean was someone entirely different. Someone who understood that sometimes survival requires you to become the very thing you've spent your life avoiding. Ruthless. I started my investigation the morning after my resurrection, as I'd begun thinking of it. Rebecca and James had left early for what they claimed was a supply run to the mainland, though I suspected they needed time to recalibrate their story and figure out their next move. That left me alone with Maria, and I had a feeling that this weathered woman with her knowing eyes might be the key to unlocking secrets that went far deeper than a simple inheritance grab. I found her in the kitchen, kneading bread with the kind of methodical rhythm that spoke of decades of practice. When she saw me, her hands stilled, and something passed across her face that looked almost like relief. "Mrs. Eleanor," she said, wiping flour from her palms on her apron. "You feeling better today? After your accident?" The way she said accident told me everything I needed to know. Maria didn't believe their story any more than I did. "Maria," I said, settling onto a stool at the kitchen island, "how long have you worked for this family?" 12 years now, since before Mr. James married Miss Rebecca." She resumed her kneading, but I could see tension in her shoulders. "I see many things in 12 years. What kind of things?" She glanced toward the windows, checking for any sign of returning vehicles, then moved closer to me. "Mrs. Eleanor, you seem like good woman, kind woman. But this house, it has secrets, dark secrets." My pulse quickened. "What kind of secrets, Maria?" "Miss Rebecca, she not who she says she is. I know this from the beginning, but Mr. James, he's so happy, so in love. I think maybe I wrong. Maybe I just jealous because he no longer need his old Maria to take care of him." She shook her head sadly. "But I not wrong. That woman, she dangerous. How do you know she's not who she says she is?" Maria disappeared into the pantry and returned with a manila envelope that looked like it had been hidden behind canned goods for months. "I find these things. In trash, in her room, places she think no one look." Inside the envelope were photocopies of documents, photographs, newspaper clippings. My hands trembled as I spread them across the granite countertop like cards in a deadly game of solitaire. The first photograph showed Rebecca, but younger, maybe in her early 20s, standing beside a man in an expensive suit. The caption underneath read, "Miranda Holbrook and businessman Charles Whitmore at Charity Gala 2018. Charles Whitmore. The name sent a chill down my spine because I knew that name. Richard had done business with Charles Whitmore 15 years ago, and it hadn't ended well. The next clipping was an obituary from a Miami newspaper, dated just 2 years ago. Charles Whitmore, 52, died unexpectedly at his home in Coral Gables, survived by his wife Miranda and 2 stepchildren. The photograph accompanying the obituary showed the same man from the charity gala, but older, more distinguished. And there, in the corner of the group photo, was Rebecca, or Miranda, or whoever she really was. She was married before, I whispered, though I'd already suspected as much from the passport I'd found. Yes, Maria nodded grimly. But look at this one. The final newspaper clipping made my blood run cold. Widow questions ruled death as natural causes. Miranda Whitmore contests coroner's report. The article was brief, but it painted a picture that made my attempted drowning look like amateur hour. Charles Whitmore had been found dead in his study, apparently of a heart attack, but toxicology reports had been inconclusive. Miranda had fought the ruling, claiming she wanted to clear any suspicion surrounding his death, but the case had been quietly closed when new evidence failed to materialize. She killed him, I said, the words falling into the kitchen's warm air like stones into still water. I think yes, Maria agreed. And now she married to your son, and you almost die in ocean yesterday. You see the pattern, Mrs. Eleanor? I saw it all too clearly. Rebecca, or Miranda, or whatever her real name was, had found a way to profit from the deaths of wealthy older men. But there was something about this situation that didn't fit the pattern. Maria, why would she want to kill me? I'm not her husband. I'm not leaving her anything in my will. Maria's expression darkened. Mrs. Eleanor, you don't know about the papers? What papers? She glanced around nervously, then leaned closer. 3 weeks ago, man in expensive suit come to house. He bring papers for you to sign. Miss Rebecca, she say you sleeping, you not feeling well? She sign for you. I see her practice your signature many times that night. The room spun around me like I was back in that drugged haze on the yacht. She forged my signature? On what? I don't know what papers say, but I hear her talking to Mr. James after. She very excited. Say something about power of attorney and medical decisions and when the time comes. Mr. James, he not happy. They have big fight that night. Power of attorney, medical decisions. The pieces were falling into place with sickening clarity. Rebecca hadn't just married James for his inheritance. She'd orchestrated a way to gain control over my affairs as well, probably through some legal document that would give her authority to make decisions about my care if I became incapacitated. And once she had that power, my death wouldn't look suspicious at all. Just a grieving daughter-in-law making difficult decisions about an elderly woman's end-of-life care. "Maria, I need you to help me," I said, gripping her flour-dusted hands. "Can you make copies of these documents? And are there security cameras in the house?" "Yes to copies, no to cameras. Miss Rebecca, she have them removed last month. She say they make her feel watched, uncomfortable." Maria's laugh was bitter. "Now I know why." We spent the next hour photocopying everything twice, with Maria hiding one set back in her pantry sanctuary and me securing the other set in a waterproof bag I tucked into my suitcase. As we worked, Maria shared more observations that painted an increasingly sinister picture. Rebecca had been asking detailed questions about my health, my medications, my daily routines. She'd shown unusual interest in my relationship with my doctors back home, particularly my cardiologist. She'd even suggested, during one of our beach walks, that the island's isolation was so peaceful that it might be the perfect place for someone to slip away peacefully when their time comes. At the time, I thought she was being philosophical. Now I realized she'd been planning my funeral. "Mrs. Eleanor," Maria said as we finished our covert documentation project, "what you going to do now? These people, they very dangerous. They try to kill you once already." It was a fair question, and one I'd been wrestling with since I'd dragged myself out of the ocean. The smart thing would be to leave, pack my bags, catch the next flight to the mainland, and put as much distance as possible between myself and this tropical nightmare. But the smart thing wouldn't protect James from whatever web Rebecca had woven around him, and it certainly wouldn't bring justice for Charles Whitmore or whoever else might have fallen victim to her particular brand of matrimonial murder. "I'm going to be very careful," I said finally, "and I'm going to find out exactly what she's done to my son." That last part was what kept me awake at night. James wasn't evil, weak maybe, easily manipulated certainly, but not evil. Which meant Rebecca had something on him, some leverage that was keeping him compliant with a plan he clearly didn't want to execute. The look on his face when he saw me surface in the water had been pure anguish, not anger or disappointment. He hadn't wanted me to die. He'd just been too trapped to prevent it. Rebecca and James returned that afternoon, loaded down with groceries, and wearing the kind of forced cheerfulness that suggested they'd spent their morning fighting. Rebecca immediately launched into an elaborate story about finding the most amazing little market in town, while James remained unusually quiet, avoiding eye contact with both of us. "Eleanor, darling," Rebecca said, unpacking what appeared to be enough food for a month-long siege. "We picked up some of those herbal teas you mentioned liking. The shopkeeper said they're wonderful for relaxation and sleep." She held up a box of chamomile tea with the kind of enthusiasm that might have seemed genuine if I hadn't just spent the morning learning about her previous husband's mysteriously inconclusive toxicology report. "How thoughtful," I replied, accepting the box with what I hoped looked like genuine gratitude. The tea would be going directly into the trash as soon as I could dispose of it safely. That evening, Rebecca suggested we have dinner on the terrace to take advantage of the perfect weather. She'd prepared what she claimed was a traditional island dish, something with fresh fish and tropical fruits that smelled absolutely divine. Under normal circumstances, I would have been delighted by the gesture. Instead, I found myself analyzing every ingredient, every spice, every sip of the wine she poured with such careful attention. "You're not eating much, Mom," James observed, and I could hear the strain in his voice. "I'm still feeling a bit queasy from yesterday," I lied. "My stomach hasn't quite recovered from all that salt water." Rebecca's eyes sharpened with what might have been disappointment. Of course, how thoughtless of me. "Here, let me get you some plain crackers. And maybe some of that herbal tea?" "That's very kind, but I think I'll just stick with water for now." The evening proceeded with the kind of stilted conversation that occurs when everyone at the table is lying about something. Rebecca asked concerned questions about my health that felt more like medical interrogations. James made awkward small talk about the weather and the scenery while his hands shook every time he reached for his wine glass. And I played the role of the grateful, slightly confused, elderly woman while every instinct I possessed screamed warnings. It was during dessert that Rebecca made her next move. "Eleanor, I've been thinking about what happened yesterday, and I'm worried that maybe we should have a doctor take a look at you, just to make sure everything is okay." She leaned forward with the kind of earnest concern that would have fooled me completely 48 hours ago. "There's a lovely private clinic on the main island. Very discreet, very comfortable. They specialize in care for people of a certain age." "That's not necessary," I said quickly. "I feel fine." "But darling, you had a traumatic experience. Sometimes the effects don't show up right away. And at your age, well, it's better to be safe than sorry." At my age. There was that phrase again, wielded like a weapon disguised as concern. "I really don't think—" "Mom," James interrupted, his voice carrying a strange note of urgency. "Maybe Rebecca's right. Maybe you should see a doctor, just to be sure." The look that passed between them was so quick I might have missed it if I hadn't been watching for it. But it was there, a flicker of communication that spoke of plans made and contingencies prepared. "I'll think about it," I said, which seemed to satisfy them for the moment. But as I lay in bed that night, listening to the familiar sound of their whispered arguments through the thin walls, I knew I was running out of time. Whatever timeline they'd been working on had been accelerated by my inconvenient survival, and they were moving towards some kind of endgame. I needed help, and I needed it from someone who couldn't be bought, threatened, or manipulated. Someone who understood that justice sometimes requires operating outside the boundaries of what's legal or proper. The next morning, while Rebecca and James were occupied with what they claimed was important business calls, I used the house phone to make a call that would change everything. Directory assistants connected me with a number I'd hoped I'd never need to use, and after 3 rings, a gravelly voice answered. "Morrison Investigations, Danny speaking." Danny Morrison. No relation, despite the shared surname, but a man whose reputation had preceded him into every shadowy corner of Miami's private investigation community. Richard had used his services years ago to investigate some business competitors, and while I'd never approved of the necessity, I'd been impressed by Danny's results. "Danny, this is Eleanor Morrison, Richard Morrison's widow." "Mrs. Morrison." The surprise in his voice was genuine. "I heard about Richard's passing. My condolences. What can I do for you?" "I need someone investigated, thoroughly, and I need it done quickly and quietly." "What kind of investigation are we talking about?" "The kind that might save my life." There was a pause, and when Danny spoke again, his voice had taken on the professional edge that I remembered from his meetings with Richard. "Where are you now?" "An island off the Florida coast. I can't leave easily, and I can't trust the local authorities." "Sounds serious." "What's the target's name?" "Rebecca Morrison. But her real name might be Miranda Catherine Holbrook." "And Danny?" "She might have killed her first husband." Another pause. "Mrs. Morrison, are you in immediate danger?" I thought about the herbal tea sitting in my room, about the concerned suggestions for medical evaluations, about the way Rebecca had watched me not eating dinner with the intensity of a predator studying wounded prey. "Yes," I said simply. "I think I am." "Okay. I'm going to need everything you have on this woman. Photos, documents, dates, locations. Can you get them to me?" "I have copies of some documents." "And Danny? I need you to look into my son James as well. I think he's being blackmailed or coerced somehow." "James Morrison? Your son?" "Yes, and I need you to find out what she has on him that's keeping him compliant. This is going to take some time, Mrs. Morrison. Can you stay safe until I have answers?" I looked out the window at the paradise that had become my prison, at the crystal clear waters that had almost become my grave, at the tropical flowers that now seemed to mock me with their innocent beauty. "I don't have a choice," I said. "How long?" "Give me 3 days, maybe 4. Can you hold out that long?" "I'll have to." "Mrs. Morrison, don't trust anyone. Don't eat or drink anything you haven't prepared yourself. And if things go south, you call me immediately. I have contacts who can extract you from that island if necessary." Extract. The word made this sound like a military operation, which I suppose it was. A war fought in paradise, with weapons disguised as kindness and battlefields that looked like family dinners. After I hung up, I sat in the quiet house and listened to the sounds of my family moving around above me, planning God knows what for their inconveniently living mother and mother-in-law. The woman who'd raised James with bedtime stories and homemade cookies was gone, replaced by someone who understood that sometimes love requires you to become dangerous. I had 3 days to stay alive, to gather more evidence, and to figure out how to save my son from the woman who had married him for the privilege of planning his mother's funeral. 3 days to prove that even at 68, Eleanor Morrison was still capable of learning new tricks. And the first trick I needed to master was how to hunt a predator while looking like prey. The game was no longer just beginning. It was escalating, and I intended to be the last one standing when the final move was made. The third day of my countdown to survival brought a revelation that shattered everything I thought I knew about my family, my marriage, and the woman I'd been for 68 years. It started with a phone call that came too early and ended with me understanding that some betrayals run so deep they reshape the very foundation of who you are. Danny's voice on the other end of the line was grim. "Mrs. Morrison, we need to talk. What I found goes way beyond what we discussed." "How bad is it?" I asked, gripping the phone so tightly my knuckles went white. "Bad enough that I'm catching the next flight to Florida. I'll be on the island tonight. But Mrs. Morrison, before I get there, you need to know something about your husband, about Richard." The world tilted sideways, just like it had when the drugs hit my system on the yacht. "What about Richard? He wasn't the man you thought he was. The Whitmore deal that went bad 15 years ago? It wasn't just a business disagreement. Richard destroyed Charles Whitmore deliberately, systematically, and illegally. Whitmore lost everything: his business, his reputation, his family's financial security. It drove him to alcoholism and eventually to an early grave. I sank into the nearest chair, my legs suddenly unable to support me. "That's impossible. Richard would never—" "Mrs. Morrison, I have the documents. Bank records, forged contracts, testimony from witnesses who were paid to lie. Your husband orchestrated one of the most sophisticated financial frauds I've ever seen. Charles Whitmore died broken because of what Richard did to him." The phone slipped from my numb fingers, clattering against the marble floor of the hallway. Through the ringing in my ears, I could hear Danny's voice calling my name, but the words seemed to be coming from another universe entirely. Richard. My Richard. The man who'd held my hand through 47 years of marriage, who'd built hospitals and funded scholarships, who'd been the moral center of our family and our community. That Richard had been a lie, a carefully constructed facade hiding a man capable of destroying lives for profit. I retrieved the phone with shaking hands. "Danny, are you saying that Miranda came after us because of what Richard did to her father-in-law?" "Former father-in-law, but yes. Charles Whitmore was her first husband's father. When Charles died, she inherited his obsession with getting revenge against the Morrison family. The marriage to James wasn't random, Mrs. Morrison. She's been planning this for years. But she killed Charles herself. The newspaper said the case was closed due to lack of evidence. But I talked to the detective who worked it. Off the record, he's convinced she poisoned him. Made it look like the alcoholism and stress finally caught up with him. Classic Black Widow technique. My mind reeled with the implications. So she killed the man she was trying to avenge? Think about it, Mrs. Morrison. Charles was a broken drunk by the time she married into the family. He wasn't capable of getting revenge on anyone, but his death made her a widow with a cause and enough inheritance to fund a long-term plan. She's not just a gold digger. She's something much more dangerous. She's a woman with a mission. I closed my eyes and tried to process this information while the tropical breeze carried the scent of jasmine through the open windows. Paradise had become purgatory, and I was beginning to understand that my torment was part of a plan that had been years in the making. "Danny, what about James? What does she have on him?" "That's where it gets complicated. Your son has been gambling, Mrs. Morrison. High-stakes poker games, offshore betting, the kind of debts that get people hurt. He owes nearly $2 million to some very unforgiving people. $2 million. The number hit me like a physical blow. How is that possible? It started small, according to my sources. A few thousand here and there. But when Rebecca entered his life, the stakes got higher. She encouraged the gambling, even fronted him money for bigger games. Classic pattern: get the mark deeper in debt, then offer to solve the problem in exchange for compliance. She set him up. From day one. The people he owes money to? They're connected to Rebecca. She's not just his wife, Mrs. Morrison. She's his handler. And the debt gives her complete control over him. I thought about James's haunted expression on the yacht, the way he'd looked when he saw me surface in the water. He hadn't wanted to kill me. He'd been forced to participate in his own mother's murder because the alternative was his own death. Danny, there's something else. She forged documents giving her power of attorney over my medical decisions. If something happens to me, she becomes your legal guardian with the authority to make end-of-life decisions. Very tidy. Your death becomes a mercy killing performed by a grieving daughter-in-law rather than murder. The pieces of the puzzle were falling into place with horrifying clarity. Rebecca hadn't just stumbled into our family. She'd infiltrated us with surgical precision, using my son's weaknesses against him and my own trusting nature against me. This wasn't a crime of passion or greed. It was a calculated campaign of revenge that had been years in the planning. Danny, how long before you get here? 6 hours? Maybe 7? Can you stay safe that long? I looked around the beautiful house that had become my prison, thinking about the herbal tea in my room and the concerned suggestions for medical evaluations. I don't know, but Danny, when you get here, bring backup. This isn't going to end quietly. After I hung up, I found Maria in the kitchen preparing lunch with her usual methodical care. When she saw my face, her hands stilled on the vegetables she'd been chopping. Mrs. Eleanor, what happened? I told her everything. About Richard's crimes, about Rebecca's true identity, about James's gambling debts, and the elaborate revenge plot that had ensnared our entire family. Maria listened in silence, her weathered face growing more troubled with each revelation. So she not just greedy woman, Maria said finally. She woman with purpose. That make her much more dangerous. Maria, I need you to do something for me. Tonight, when Danny arrives, I want you to let him in through the service entrance. Don't tell James or Rebecca that anyone is coming. You think they try something before your friend arrive? I think time is running out for their plan, and desperate people make dangerous choices. As if summoned by our conversation, Rebecca appeared in the kitchen doorway, wearing a flowing sundress and the kind of radiant smile that had once made me grateful to have her as a daughter-in-law. There you are, Eleanor. I've been looking everywhere for you. She moved into the kitchen with the fluid grace of someone completely comfortable in her own skin, completely confident in her own lies. I have wonderful news. I contacted that private clinic I mentioned, and they have an opening this afternoon. We can take the helicopter over right now and have you checked out by their best doctors. The helicopter. Of course. No messy yacht accident this time, no inconvenient survival stories. Just a sick elderly woman being transported for emergency medical care, with her loving daughter-in-law making all the difficult decisions when the time came. That's very thoughtful, Rebecca, but I'm feeling much better today. I don't think it's necessary. Her smile never wavered, but something shifted in her eyes. A calculation, a recalibration of tactics. Eleanor, darling, I'm afraid I have to insist. You see, James and I have been talking to your doctors back home, and they're very concerned about some of your recent test results. What test results? Your cardiac enzyme levels, your kidney function, signs of early cognitive decline. The doctors think you may have suffered more damage from yesterday's accident than we initially realized. She moved closer, her voice taking on the gentle but firm tone one might use with a confused child. The clinic specializes in cases like yours. They can make you very comfortable while they run their tests. Make me comfortable. The euphemism sent chills down my spine. I want to speak to my doctors myself before I agree to anything. Of course, darling. But the clinic doesn't have time to wait for lengthy consultations. The helicopter is already on its way. We need to leave in 20 minutes. 20 minutes. Not enough time for Danny to arrive, not enough time to implement any kind of escape plan. I looked at Maria, whose dark eyes reflected my own growing panic. "Where's James?" I asked, stalling for time. "Packing your overnight bag. He's as concerned as I am about your condition." I doubted that very much. More likely, James was upstairs wrestling with his conscience while packing the clothes I'd be buried in. "Rebecca, I need a few minutes to freshen up before we go." "Of course. But Eleanor?" Her voice carried a steel edge that she'd never let slip before. "Don't take too long. The doctors are waiting." I excused myself and headed for my room, my mind racing through increasingly desperate options. The house phone was in the kitchen, under Rebecca's watchful eye. My cell phone was in my purse, but would she give me enough privacy to make a call? Could I barricade myself in my room and wait for Danny? Would that just accelerate whatever timeline they were working on? As I reached the top of the stairs, I heard voices from James's room. The door was slightly ajar, and I could see him stuffing clothes into a suitcase with movements that spoke of barely controlled panic. "I can't do this, Rebecca," he was saying, his voice cracking with strain. "She's my mother. There has to be another way." "There is no other way." Rebecca's voice was cold, clinical, completely different from the warm tones she used with me. "The debts won't wait, James. Marco's people don't care about your feelings. They want their money, and if they don't get it soon, they'll take it out of your hide." "But killing her? We're not killing her. We're providing compassionate end-of-life care for a woman whose quality of life has deteriorated beyond recovery. The doctors will confirm that she's suffering, that continued treatment would be cruel and unusual. I'll make the difficult decision to let her go peacefully. And then what? We inherit everything and live happily ever after while my mother rots in a grave? Then you get to keep breathing, and I get justice for what your father did to my family. Everyone wins except the people who deserve to lose." I pressed myself against the wall, barely breathing as I listened to them plan my death with the casual efficiency of people discussing dinner plans. This was it, the final proof of their intentions, the confirmation that I was living on borrowed time. But as I stood there in the hallway of my own house, eavesdropping on my own murder, something inside me shifted. The fear that had been driving me for days transformed into something harder, colder, more focused. These people had underestimated Eleanor Morrison, and that was going to be their fatal mistake. I crept back downstairs and found Maria in the laundry room, her usual refuge when she wanted to avoid the family drama that played out in the main rooms. "Maria," I whispered, "do you have a way to contact the mainland? Something they don't know about?" She nodded toward an old radio hidden behind boxes of cleaning supplies. "Emergency radio, for hurricanes and such." "Why?" "I need you to call the Coast Guard. Tell them there's a medical emergency on the island, that someone is being held against their will. Tell them to send armed officers." "You sure about this, Mrs. Eleanor?" "Once you make this call, there's no going back." I thought about Charles Whitmore, drinking himself to death over crimes my husband had committed. I thought about James, trapped in a web of debt and manipulation, being forced to participate in his own mother's murder. I thought about Rebecca, or Miranda, or whatever her name really was, using love and family bonds as weapons in her quest for revenge. I'm sure. "Make the call, Maria. It's time to end this." While Maria contacted the authorities, I went back upstairs and did something I hadn't done since I was a child playing hide-and-seek with my brothers. I hid. Not in my room, where they'd look for me, but in the small storage space behind the water heater, a cramped alcove that would be invisible to anyone conducting a casual search. From my hiding place, I could hear the house erupting into controlled chaos as they realized I was missing. Rebecca's voice carried clearly up the stairs, no longer bothering with the sweet tones she'd used to manipulate me. "Find her, James. She can't have gone far. Check the beach, check the gardens, check every room in this house." "Maybe she just went for a walk," James suggested, hope evident in his voice. "She knows, you idiot. Somehow she figured it out, and now she's hiding from us." Rebecca's composure was cracking, revealing the calculating predator beneath. "We have maybe an hour before someone starts asking questions about why she didn't show up at the clinic." An hour. I just had to stay hidden for an hour, maybe less, if the Coast Guard responded quickly to Maria's call. I could do this. I'd survived 68 years, a loveless first marriage, the death of my parents, Richard's business crises, and my son's troubled adolescence. I could survive one more hour. But then I heard the sound that changed everything. A helicopter approaching the island. "That's not the medical transport," Rebecca said, her voice carrying clearly through the house. "That's a Coast Guard chopper." The game was over, but I wasn't sure who had won. I heard running footsteps, slamming doors, urgent voices conferring in rapid whispers. Then James's voice, loud and clear. "Mom, Mom, where are you? The Coast Guard is here. They say someone called in an emergency." I emerged from my hiding place to find James standing at the bottom of the stairs, his face a mask of confusion and fear. Behind him, Rebecca paced like a caged animal, her carefully constructed persona completely abandoned. "Eleanor," she said when she saw me, her voice carrying a venom that made her previous sweetness seem impossibly naive. "How clever of you. How very, very clever." Through the windows, I could see uniformed officers approaching the house. Safety was just yards away, but Rebecca's expression suggested that she wasn't planning to go quietly. "It's over, Rebecca. Or should I call you Miranda?" Her laugh was bitter as winter wind. "Oh, Eleanor, you think this is over? This is just the beginning. You may have figured out who I am, but you still don't understand what I am." She reached into her purse and withdrew something small and silver. A syringe. "Rebecca, no." James lunged toward her, but she moved with the fluid grace of someone who'd been planning this moment for a very long time. The needle found its mark in my arm before I could react, the pain sharp and immediate. Whatever she'd injected burned through my bloodstream like liquid fire, and I felt my legs give out beneath me. "Insulin," she said conversationally as I collapsed to the marble floor. "Massive overdose. You'll go into hypoglycemic shock within minutes. Even if they get you to a hospital, the brain damage will be irreversible." A tragic end to a woman who'd been struggling with her health. The Coast Guard officers were at the door now, their voices authoritative and urgent. But the world was already beginning to blur around the edges, and I could feel my heart racing as my blood sugar plummeted toward dangerous levels. "Mom!" James dropped to his knees beside me, his hands shaking as he tried to check my pulse. "What did you do to her?" "I gave her what she deserved," Rebecca said calmly. "What your father should have gotten years ago. Justice has a way of finding people, James, even if it takes decades." But as the darkness closed in around me, I heard something that made me smile despite the poison coursing through my veins. Danny Morrison's voice, rough and authoritative, cutting through Rebecca's monologue like a knife through silk. "Step away from her, lady. Now." The cavalry had arrived, and Eleanor Morrison was going to live to fight another day. But as the paramedics worked to stabilize my blood sugar and the Coast Guard officers read Rebecca her rights, I realized that surviving this ordeal was only the beginning. I'd learned things about my husband, my family, and myself that would require a lifetime to process. Richard's crimes had created this monster, and now it was up to me to find a way to live with that knowledge while building something better from the wreckage of everything I'd believed to be true. The war was over, but the real battle, the one for my family's soul, was just beginning. And this time, Eleanor Morrison intended to win.